First I want to start with just telling you, I was at a conference a few years ago. I was invited to a conference in Geneva 3 or 4 years ago at the International Labour Organization, which is a branch of the UN. And it was all about skills shortages and skills mismatches. And it was an event that kind of had a sort of, if you like, the sort of gathered wisdom of academics and industry leaders and a few hangers-on like me, trying to work out how to anticipate skills shortages locally and nationally. Now, this is a really big issue for employers, for economies, and for universities to think about, because actually it's a really tricky topic to work out what to do with. How do you anticipate skills needs in any given place or any given organization? So I was, as you can imagine, quite excited to hear what the opening keynote speaker had to say, who was a sort of eminent speaker in the field. And he got up to speak, and his opening line was, "We've been trying to work out how to anticipate skills needs for the last 50 years, and we still haven't worked it out yet." So I was slightly disappointed. I thought, did I really need to travel to Geneva to work this out? So that was kind of my start point, thinking about some of what I'm going to say today. So my name is Martin Edmundson. I'm the CEO of a social enterprise called Gradcore. And we spend our time working between the worlds of graduate recruitment and higher education employability, and trying to, in a way, help them understand each other a little bit better. And I want to spend the next few minutes talking about how things like how the idea of career wiggly lines are a useful concept that can help us think about everything from skills shortages to graduate attributes, and perhaps particularly address my thoughts to both employers and universities, who are the two main groups of organisations that we serve. But also, in the process of doing that, hopefully provide some useful insights for students and graduates. I'm also a Keele graduate, so it's really nice to be back. I was here in the late 90s studying English and music, and I have a lot to thank this university for. It's a place I really enjoyed studying at, and formed a lot of my thoughts and a lot of my character that I think went on to be useful later in life. It's also responsible for helping me meet these bunch of guys here. See if you can spot me on there. This is about 1997 on the steps of the Students' Union in Keele, and I'm going to tell you a bit more about these guys later, but I'd particularly like to highlight the very slight-looking ginger-haired chap at the back there. That's Derv. So more about him a little bit later on. So, I want to talk about wiggly lines. Now, this might seem an odd thing to want to talk about, but let me define what I mean by wiggly lines. In a dry sense, what I'm talking about is the idea of non-linear careers, the fact that perhaps a lot of people don't go on to work in the area that they studied in. The fact that in this country in particular, we don't have a slavish tie between what you studied when you first when you were at university and when you were in education, through to what you went on to do when you worked. Now, career wiggly lines are perhaps a useful concept because they actually also help us think about skills shortages and understanding the different things that go on in terms of understanding where people come from and where they go. Now, I first started thinking about this when I was looking at the idea of benchmark statements. Now, that sounds pretty dull. Now, what benchmark statements are the... I was looking at benchmark statements for English degrees in UK universities. Now, benchmark statements are the sort of single source document that academics and students and employers use to define what should be in an English degree. Now, we were a kind of group of employers gathered together to give our reflections about English graduates and what we saw from them, whether we hired them, what they tended to go on to do, to try and guide what should be in curriculum in future in English degrees. And actually what we universally did was praise kind of what we saw in English degrees as being really helpful and beneficial, the fact that actually English graduates tended to go on into all sorts of different disciplines, and a sense of the wiggly line that went from English degrees to all sorts of different kinds of work. Now, this isn't the same everywhere around the world. If you, for example, you look at the US, there's a much more direct line between the subject you study and then what you go on to do in terms of work. I had the privilege of speaking to the head of early talent in both the UK branch and the US branch of one of the big four accountancy and consulting firms. And what was really interesting in that was that the US side hire about 80% of their graduates from an accountancy or a finance major, whereas in the UK, that number was more like about 40% And actually, in fact, the UK branch of that Big Four company was perfectly happy to recruit people from, for example, a fine art background. So immediately we start to see this sort of sense of wiggly lines. But that idea of wiggly lines and ambiguity is a little bit under threat. I spend also some time in things like local skills boards, talking to perhaps SMEs and people trying to energize their local economies about how, what kind of skills they might need in that area. And there's a common rhetoric there that says, actually what we need is more people to study business, because then there will be more business savvy, and that's going to be more useful and more employable, and that will make us more productive. But actually that ignores the fact that actually in many cases, subjects that are often criticized and often perhaps seen as slightly frivolous subjects at university outperform business when it comes to graduate destinations, salaries, and performance in the labour market. I'll give you an example. So if we took the unemployment rates of graduates, so in the latest UK data, unemployment rates 6 months after graduation, what we see is that performing arts graduates are about 4.6% unemployed, business graduates about 5.6% unemployed, and IT graduates 9.7% unemployed. Now that's quite interesting, because actually when I speak to recruiters, the biggest skill shortage they talk about is for IT and tech graduates, and yet we have a higher than average unemployed cohort of computer science and IT graduates in this country. So there's something going wrong there. Now, there's a whole other TED talk on that particular topic, and I'm not going to do that today. But what I'd like to talk about is the labels that we put on people, and why perhaps there's some dangers in those labels in terms of actually giving us a clear sense of what people potentially can go on and do, and who as employers we should think about hiring. So in a sense, career wiggly lines is not about career path or career trajectory. It's about career ambiguity. And it's about the idea of embracing career ambiguity, both in the development of people and in the recruitment of people. So I'm going to talk about putting labels on people. This is my colleague John. Didn't like having a label put on him either. Putting labels on people and how that relates to skills shortages. So if we look at skills shortages, as I was saying, it's a really tricky business trying to work out how to anticipate and deal with skills shortages. If you look at the UK at the moment, we're struggling, for example. So if you look at Australia at the moment, they're actually saying they've got too many teachers, whereas if you look at the UK at the moment, we haven't got enough teachers, and actually that shortage is set to continue. Also, if you look at the UK, we're going to be short of doctors, nurses, fruit pickers, everything. I'm not going to do the Brexit talk today, but we've got challenges in terms of skills shortages. But actually, perhaps that's not, looking at those labels is not perhaps the most useful way to look at it. We often label people as well in terms of qualifications. Recently, there were two contradictory reports put out about this. Universities UK put out a report saying there are not enough graduates in the labour market. We need more graduates. The Chartered Institute of Personal Development, who represent kind of HR people, put out a report saying there are too many graduates. Now, Universities UK, you'd kind of expect to take that position, that there should be more graduates. They after all, represent universities. But interestingly, the CIPD as well, perhaps you'd expect their view as well, because they tend to have a sort of, almost a kind of reverse snobbery about graduates, and a kind of sense that perhaps that's the label of graduate is unhelpful. Now, whichever of those kind of sides you take, what we can really see is that actually it's not the labels that are really the useful thing. It's what sits underneath that that is important. And what sits underneath that is a set of deeper attributes that we need to think about. So I was trying to think about how to illustrate this and think about perhaps how those labels are not useful and we need to look beneath at the kind of deeper attributes. And I came across this. Now, it's quite a small diagram, but I'll try and give you a sense of what's going on here. This is from an organisation called TALA in Boston, and that's Massachusetts, not Lincolnshire. What you've got here is a set of dots all around the screen. And down the side here, a label and a code of different job titles. Now, what they did was, using some very kind of clever AI and algorithm, they basically kind of captured a load of information from both job adverts and CVs that applied for those job adverts to try and kind of classify and understand the sorts of people and the attributes they had that applied for and got certain jobs. And as you can see, there is certain clustering, so all the research scientists are kind of clustered together and all the systems engineers are kind of clustered together, but there's also a lot of coloured dots next to them that are very similar. What that tells us is that there is a whole bunch of talent sitting there with very similar attributes and very similar capabilities, but we're not as employers, we're not necessarily looking to recruit them because actually they have a different label on their head of the kind of job they've done, whereas actually their capabilities and attributes could be really suitable for what we are looking to recruit. So, if we've got this kind of challenge with labels and we know we need to look at underlying attributes, I'd like to just think about attributes in terms of then how we develop those in people, and particularly how that happens maybe both at university and then in terms of how we recruit for that. Now, the idea of graduates or any kind of people having personal attributes is not a new idea. The private school system in this country for a long time has had a set of Latin mottos which basically are all about inculcating a set of behaviours and attitudes that sit beneath subjects. So they've kind of known that this was important for perhaps hundreds of years. But what actually perhaps is different is the idea of codifying and then kind of embedding graduate attributes within the curriculum of universities at a deep and a meaningful level. Now, to some extent, this has been going on for a while. Graduate attributes first sort of emerged as a kind of discipline in universities about 20 years ago in the Southern Hemisphere. And it first came along as the kind of concept of saying, well, in our university, we develop graduates who are critical thinkers or empathetic communicators and certain phrases like that. And it came across to the UK quite soon afterwards, but fairly quickly got a bad name. And the reason it got a bit of a bad name was it was first done as a kind of marketing veneer. So what happened was it found its way into the prospectus saying, if you come to this university, you will be this kind of graduate. But actually what happened was it stayed in the prospectus and it didn't make it any further. And what I'd like to kind of posit is the idea of kind of graduate attributes 2.0. So a new approach that is much more meaningful, one where we take graduate attributes from being a kind of sales and marketing veneer to being embedded and meaningful, from the prospectus to the curriculum. Now, imagine, if you will, a kind of situation then where graduate attributes such as emotional intelligence or creativity are embedded and actively taught and articulated in every single module of every single degree across a whole university. Now, for those of you who have ever designed curriculum, that sounds like quite a scary prospect, but actually it is possible, and it's already happening, in fact, in various universities in this country. And what that does is start to provide a bridge between the idea of high-quality taught subjects with underlying attributes that are developmental and will help people access the world of work. Now, this is partly useful because recruiters have been thinking in this way for a long time. If you look at the way graduate recruiters recruit talent at the moment, it's built around the idea of attributes. It's not really built around the idea of skills and qualifications. Recruiters don't really trust things like 2-1s or UCAS points or even the subject you've studied. What they trust is their own ability to use highly sophisticated selection tools to draw out your values, your attributes, and your strengths. Any of you who've been to a graduate recruitment assessment centre will know that that's the case. So actually, there's a really powerful argument for helping students and graduates in university develop those things to get through those kind of processes and be more effectively understand which organisation they will fit in. And in essence, that's where our career Wiggly line has come from in this country. It's the fact that our employers have taken time and effort and energy to work out the attributes and values that matter to them and then develop ways of recruiting in those, for those attributes and those values and those strengths. And that's an important strength, I think, for our economy. Now, I'm not arguing that we should be recruiting doctors from anything other than medicine degrees. There are limits to this argument. But actually, in most spaces of the economy, that career ambiguity from subject to job is actually a really healthy thing. So I'd like to just try and bring these arguments together. So the things I've talked about career wiggly lines, about the labels we put on people and whether they're helpful or not, and then the idea of graduate attributes, kind of 2.0. The first thing I'd like to say is that actually we should embrace this ambiguity. I think it's a really positive thing for our economy and for people as individuals to not be too constrained or restricted within certain straight lines. I also think it's perhaps a really powerful way to protect often kind of castigated subjects in the arts and humanities, which have huge value to the economy, but are often seen perhaps as not well connected into the labour market. And there was just an example I saw last night of a university dropping humanities subjects under this because they didn't take the kind of argument I'm saying into account. So addressing the two audiences I started with, employers and universities. So universities, I think what this means for universities is thinking about attributes fully embedded in every part of your curriculum, and perhaps starting to conceptualize and think of the idea of a personalized employability journey of every one of your students from the start of their time at your university through to well after they have left. And thinking about how you embed that in everything that you do, but also how those attributes are built into all of the different aspects of curriculum that you create and develop. From an employer perspective, I think what it means is not using classic measures to anticipate skills shortages. A big part of how we measure skills shortages is flawed because we use the labels based around sector and subject and those kind of things, when in fact we see so many people go in these career wiggly lines. The exciting thing for employers, when you go back to that sort of neural map I showed you earlier on, is that actually there's some huge talent pools of people to go out and find that you haven't perhaps been looking for before. Not necessarily that far away from the people that you were originally recruiting for, but perhaps with a different label on their head. And there's a huge opportunity within that. So I can't finish without telling you what happened to these guys. This is us about a year ago, and a little bit about the career wiggly lines. So one of these guys studied international relations, is now a journalist. One studied philosophy and is now in banking, worked that one out. And I studied English and music and now run a social enterprise working in higher education and early talent. And as you can see, Derv just worked on his beard. So there you go. But what I would say is I asked these guys about what they thought their career wiggly lines were about. And what they told me was that to them it was about the versatility and the pragmatism that they developed during their time here at Keele. In particular, perhaps from studying dual honours subjects that created an inherent versatility in what we were all able to go on and do. None of us particularly going in much of a straight line from what we studied to what we ended up working in. But I think that's a strength and something to be celebrated. And in the end, I think it's about, as I say, for universities and employers, thinking about the idea of a personalised journey through everything from from a university perspective, a personalised journey of employability, and from an employer perspective, thinking about the idea of a personalised development journey as you both recruit and develop people into the organisation. In the end, there are thousands and thousands of different journeys that students and graduates can take. Some are straight, some are wiggly. But our job, I think, as educators and employers, is to help those journeys to begin and to take them through to success. Thanks for listening.